Yes, yes, thank you. Well, one of the theories that is often talked about these days to explain away the 6 days of creation is that, well, this is just another one of those creation stories that you get in every culture. And our story is just taken from some ancient Babylonian writings, and then it was cleaned up a bit to make it a bit so there is not quite so much fighting and bloodshed and things like that that you find in the pagan stories. But if you actually look at what's in the scripture, that doesn't make any sense at all. In fact, this is a very logical and clear story. It's quite plain. There's nothing obscure or difficult about it. You'll often find that used as an excuse for not believing it. No, it's very clear and it's very logical. And if you think about it, the whole purpose of the creation of the world and the universe is that God is creating a home for man. Now, if you look at it from that point of view, it all falls into place very well, and it's very logical and sensible. Because if you are going to build a home for people, uh, you have to start with building the infrastructure and then meeting all of the needs that the people are going to need. So let's have a look at the days of creation. If we go to the days of creation, and then we'll look at a couple of examples of why it doesn't make any sense if you try and extend it into millions of years, which is one of the things that people try to do if they don't want to believe it. So first of all, well, we start with God collecting the materials and the basic components, except that he has to make them. If we want to build a home for someone, we collect materials that have already been made, but God spoke and things came into being. Now that does not take time. Think about when Jesus turned water into wine. Water has very few atoms in it, right? Hydrogen, oxygen. Wine has all sorts of different molecules in it. Jesus spoke, and all of a sudden these appeared. It didn't take time. God spoke, and it was. So God can speak all of the matter into existence straight away. You don't need time for that. And we have the earth, which was covered by water. So the earth has always had water. And it's interesting, there's an ongoing debate about where the Earth's water came from in the secular science world, because people believe, well, the Earth was formed when the solar system was formed out of a great big mass of swirling dust, which would have not had water in it on the original Earth. So there are all sorts of theories about how the water was brought to Earth by asteroids and meteorites and things like that. But no, the water was already there. Water is very important for life, which is why NASA scientists and astronomers are spending millions and billions of dollars trying to find planets with water elsewhere in the universe, because they know that water is essential for life. Well, yes, it is, but just because you find water somewhere out in the universe doesn't mean there's life, because water can't create life. So the earth was covered with water, and God said, let there be light. So we have the heavens, the earth with water, we have light. So we have matter and energy. We have all of the basic raw materials, as it were. So God then moves on and starts to build the infrastructure. So we have on the second day the waters above and below, and between them there's a spread out layer. Now, a lot of modern translations of the Bible use the word dome when it says that God separated the waters above and below, because they're fitting in with that idea, which does come from ancient pagan cultures, that somehow the earth sits at the bottom of a solid dome, and there are other things out in the sky sitting on this. But in fact, the Hebrew word there just means a spread out layer. So in modern parlance, we might call that the atmosphere. So we're building the infrastructure, and God keeps going with that. On the third day, he makes the land and the sea. Wouldn't you love to see the video replay of day 3? I mean, that must have been incredibly exciting with the land being rising up above the water, because remember, the earth started out covered by water, but now we've got a separation with land and sea. And we've also got the first living things, the first biological structures, which are plants, and it specifically says according to their kinds. So they didn't start out as single cells in the sea that somehow crawled out onto land and eventually evolved into trees and grasses and all sorts of other things like that. God spoke, and it was according to their kind. So this is also building the infrastructure, because plants are going to be the habitat for things to live in and also to be the source of food. So again, we've got a logical, clear story that makes lots of sense. And again, God doesn't need time for this. Jesus made living cells in all of the people that he healed instantly. Remember the man with the withered hand? Jesus just said, stretch out your hand, and his hand was whole and functioning. Right, now that would have meant millions of living cells all at once. So God spoke, and it was. It doesn't take time. It just needs sufficient knowledge and sufficient power. And God has all of that. So we have plants according to their kinds. They didn't change from one thing to the other. They were there, made, fully formed, ready to function, ready to serve their purpose. Again, this is a logical, sensible story, because the plants need to be there before the animals and birds and other things, because they are needed for habitat and for food, and also to keep the whole system, the ecological system, going. And we'll come to that in a moment. Now, we have a bit of a digression in day 4, because we go up into outer space, and we have the sun and the moon and the stars. Now, the word stars does include planets. The word planets just means moving stars. Now, another excuse that's used by people who don't want to believe in 6 days as described in the Bible, they say, oh, well, the creation story is just about why God did things. It doesn't tell us how he did it. Well, on day 4, we are given a why. We are told the purpose. The sun and the moon and the stars, and in other words, the lights in the sky that we see from the earth, right, were for signs, times, and seasons. They were to communicate. Now, who were they to communicate with? Well, we know that stars are used for navigation, and in fact, some birds and even animals can navigate by the stars, even beetles. This is a story you'll find in our fact file about dung beetles actually use the pattern of the Milky Way to orientate themselves. But mainly their purpose is for signs, times, and seasons for people. This is a way that God is going to serve people. So all of those amazing things out there are for us. And it also says that the sun and the moon are there to give light on the earth. So God has already made light. Light does have its own existence. But now God is setting up a self-sustaining system where the sun is going to be the ultimate source of light, and the moon is going to reflect that sunlight onto the earth. And that has a purpose as well. And the whole system of the movement of the sun and the moon and the stars gives us signs, times, and seasons. So again, we're building a home for people, and this is as much a part of it as the basic infrastructure and the food sources and things like that. So now we go back to the earth, and we have the water creatures and the flying creatures. So God is filling up the ecological zones, and again, according to their kind, one didn't change into the other. They were there, fully functioning and ready to be part of a functioning ecosystem. And then finally, on day 6, the land animals, again according to their kinds, And the animals in the Bible are described basically in three categories. We have sort of the wild animals, the beasts of the earth, and we have domestic animals or livestock. And that's an interesting point because there are all sorts of theories about how animals became domesticated and how it took sort of many generations, sort of hundreds and thousands of years for wild animals to become domestic. No, it seems that there are some animals that were just made to be closely associated with human beings, and some that are meant to live out in the environment. All right, and then there are also the creeping things, the things that crawl on the ground, and those are all the creepy crawlies and things like that, which some of us don't like, but they have an important function. So we've now built a functioning ecosystem with all its components, so we're ready for the first human beings, and we're given a lot of details about the creation of human beings, right? You need to go to Genesis 2 for that, but one man and one woman. So forget millions of years and groups of hominids and things like that. So we now have this consistent, logical story, and it all makes sense. And it could only happen in a short time. It could only work if it was made in a short time, because very important biological principle, nothing in the living world works in isolation. And we are learning more and more of that. The more we study the living world, the more we study even the minutiae down to the microscopic, and the more we study the big whole environment aspect of it. So we've looked at a couple of examples of this. A little while ago, we looked at how plants need pollinators and seed dispersers and soil conditioners. That's a well-known example of how God made functioning ecosystems and how the different things are meant to work together. And again, the time issue. How long can the plants wait for their pollinators? Well, less than one generation, really, which means that plants like these, which are annual plants that grows, be pollinated and set seed and reproduce all within 1 year, right? You don't have much time for those to evolve over millions of years, right? In fact, unless they're made right straight away, that's not going to work at all. But let's look at a couple of other more different examples. Everyone thinks we have very weird plants in Australia. Well, we do have some rather strange looking plants. And one of the things we see is how well plants and their pollinators fit together. And these are kangaroo paws, but they're not pollinated by kangaroos. They're pollinated by these rather lovely birds, honey eaters. And they are just the right size and shape that when a honey eater comes along and drinks nectar from them, the pollen, which you can see projecting out there from the flower in the middle there, brushes the head of the bird. So again, the theory that this was originally one round flower that was pollinated by insects, but somehow changed its shape so it could be pollinated by this bird, that doesn't make any sense at all. Even though this is not an annual plant, it's a more long-lived plant. You have to get this match right straight away. So let's look at some lesser well-known examples. Here are some of my favorite flowers. I love water lilies, not only from their shape and their form, but also they have an interesting relationship with their pollinators. Now, they are pollinated by insects, which means the insects have to fly over water. Now, the standard story of water lilies is that they were originally a land plant, but somehow they decided to move back into the water. Not quite sure how that happened, but again, it doesn't make any sense that they would do that over millions of years. Why would they do that for a start? But anyway, they grow in the water now, and to be pollinated by insects, the insects have to fly over water. Insects are very small, and they tend to lose heat if they do that. But of course, the insects then have to take the pollen to another flower. And when you've got really, really small insects like these sort of tiny, weeny native bees that we have in Australia, they certainly lose heat. Well, these flowers actually generate heat. Now, that takes energy from the flower. So why did the flower decide to do that? No, this was designed very well right from the start. It functions right from the start. Now, we actually measured this. We did some experiments and some observations with the water lilies that grow in John Mackay's backyard, where he has them growing there. And you can actually see the results of that on one of our videos or whatever medium it's now on. It was originally a video, but anyway, it's part of our Darwin series called Darwin's Evolution, a Very Unnatural Selection. And you'll see how brilliant these things are that produce heat. Now, that takes a lot of energy from the plant, but it is worth it for the plant to be pollinated. Again, we see things that require forward planning. It doesn't fit into Darwin's theory of the struggle for life, where everything's in competition and everything's trying to serve itself. Now, here are some fish, and notice what they're swimming over. What's underneath there are some plants. Now, these are not seaweeds. There are plants called sea grasses, and they are, again, supposedly land plants that decided to move back in the water. So sea grasses are actually a flowering plant, just like a grass that grows in the soil on dry land, which means they will produce pollen and seeds. So again, how do they disperse their seeds? They need seed dispersers just like plants that live on the land. Well, recently scientists have done some studies of that, and yes, their seeds will float away in the water, but also fish, terrapins, and some seabirds will actually eat their seeds. They'll forage among the seagrass and eat their seeds. Now, but then if the seeds get completely digested and absorbed, well, that's no good to the plant. So the seeds have to be designed to actually pass through the digestive system and be deposited out the other end. So again, forward planning is needed. This doesn't work by millions of years of one step after the other. You have to get it right within the generation within the lifespan of this living thing. Now, the other interesting thing is this is another type of seagrass, is that more and more we are finding examples of symbiosis and commensalism and various other forms of very, very close cooperation. And there's been some interesting studies that you can read about in our fact file. How do the seagrasses get their soil and water conditioning, just like the land plants need soil conditioners as well? We looked at an example a little while ago with the worms at Jurassic Ark. And it's interesting that, like some land plants, seagrasses need nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they have been found in some seagrasses. Another interesting study was about seagrass meadows, where scientists found that there were a lot of bivalves, that's sort of little shellfish with two shells, seem to thrive in these seagrass meadows. Well, that makes sense because the seagrasses, like any other plants, make oxygen, so that's very good. But also they discovered that the bivalves have a symbiotic relationship with sulfide digesting bacteria, which help condition the water for the seagrasses. Otherwise, the sulfides would badly affect them. So we have seagrasses, bacteria, and bivalves. We've got a three-way symbiosis, not just a two-way one, as you have with the nitrogen-fixing bacteria and other examples of symbiosis that you might know about. So more and more we are finding that symbiosis, cooperation is the norm. Nothing in the living world works in isolation. God made functioning ecosystems right from the start, and that has to be done quickly. Otherwise, it won't work at all. So, millions of years of chance random processes with completely different sorts of creatures evolving in parallel. For example, how did the water lily evolve the heat generating when it knew, so that the insects would be able to fly away? Even the whole issue of pollination. How did the insects change their feeding tubes into, or their mouth parts into feeding tubes to suck nectar? That was a statement that David Attenborough made many years ago on his original evolution series called Life on Earth. I remember him making that statement, and I thought that's a very Lamarckian statement, but that's another issue. But it's, how did the genes of one completely different organism affect the genes of another to change their body shapes and their physiology to match? No, God made functioning ecosystems. You have to do that quickly. So 6 days in creation, the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. That is a logical story that stands up to any honest scientific scrutiny. And the more we look at the world around us, the more it fits.